Well, welcome. I am Jim Bowman, coordinator of Fox Cities Advocates for Public Education. We are a group of parents, grandparents, educators, and concerned citizens who care deeply about a strong public education system in the Fox Cities. Today's presentation is on public school finance, and our presenter is Dr. Julie Underwood, whom I will introduce to you in just a few minutes. Please keep your audio on mute throughout this presentation. If you have questions or comments, I hope you'll put them in chat addressed to Fox Cities Advocates for Public Education. Periodically, we will monitor the chat, and at appropriate times, we will bring those questions out and we will ask them of Julie. Julie Underwood received her bachelor's degree in political science from DePaul University, her law degree from Indiana University, and her PhD in educational leadership from the University of Florida. Julie served as chair of the UW Department of Educational Administration, where she became the first woman to earn tenure in that department, and eventually the first female to be the dean of the School of Education. Today, she will speak to us on school finance. So join me in welcoming Dr. Julie Underwood.
Thank you. Thank you, Jim, and thank you, Carol and Patty and everybody who's here. We've got a really broad audience, but that's kind of the nature of a group like the Fox City Advocates, people of all walks of life with the shared interest of improving public education. So I think I'm going to share my screen am I sharing my screen now?
Yes.
Okay, so you can see, Patty, thank you very much for doing that for me. I appreciate it. So we want to talk about school finance today.
We do not see your screen yet, Julie.
Oh, you don't?
No.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I thought you were asking if we're ready. We're ready for you to.
No.
There we go.
And then she'll put it in presentation view and we'll be ready to go.
There we are. You know, it's always a challenge of trying to get all of the buttons pushed at the right time. But I appreciate everybody being here, and I appreciate people's interest. Oh, wait.
I'm going to ask you to swap your display up in the corner. Thank you.
Okay. That doesn't work really well, but.
Oh.
So, well, we'll figure that out. Now
we see your next slide and notes.
Okay. We'll just figure out how to do this.
Do you have a use slideshow option? There it is. How does that work for you?
That's all right. I'll deal with it. So school finance is something that I'm passionate about. It is not one of my teaching areas, but I'm certainly passionate about school finance because it's so important. You know, if we can't provide a stable financial foundation for our schools, it's hard to be sure that all children learn. So it's something that I'm pretty passionate about. And in the state of Wisconsin, the public school system of funding is pretty complex. So we're going to go over some School Finance 101, and then we're going to talk about some challenges that we have in the area and challenges we have in public schools generally that really do need resources to help. So here's kind of a list of, here's my preparatory set. We're going to talk about basically how school finance works. We'll look at some voucher stuff. And some context for the state of Wisconsin in terms of challenges to schools of increased poverty, diversity, declining enrollment, and then, oh yeah, and there happens to be a pandemic going on. So all of those things. And what I'd like to do is to go through a piece, and then I'm gonna pause and see if we have questions in the chat. We're a pretty small group, so we should be able to take questions and move along at whatever pace you want to. And that'll work for me. I'm glad to answer questions as we go along. But this gives you an idea of the kind of topics that I hope to talk about. So let's, oh, I have to do it this way, right? So let's look at some basics of school finance in the state of Wisconsin. It is a very odd system, unlike any other system in the United States. And as a matter of fact, when they categorize state school finance systems, they have one category, which is other, and that's the state of Wisconsin. It defies categorization, mainly because we've had it for so long and we just keep adding things onto it. It's the worst Charlie Brown Christmas tree in the world because we just keep hanging things on it over and over and over again. And we have not restructured the basics of it for years, for decades. So that's one of the things that makes it complex. It's also incredibly opaque. And many people in school finance say that not even some of the best wizards, except for maybe Brian Ponke, know immediately what the outcome is going to be if you change something. So district administrators, superintendents around the state really do have to wait, to pause a bit, to know how something is going to impact them, because they've got to get a second opinion. And I hope we have a couple or a few superintendents with us today. And please feel free to add, disagree, or correct me for sure, because you live with this stuff every day, and I want to make sure that we respect and learn from your expertise as well. I'm a school attorney, and so I always have to start with the legal background of school finance. And this is the Wisconsin Constitution, Article 10, Section 3. I'm not going to read it to you, but my point here is to make sure that people always remember that public schooling is required in the state of Wisconsin, in terms of the Constitution requires the legislature to create this system of public schools or district schools, and that it is a state obligation. Now, the state delegates it, but when the rubber hits the road, this is a state obligation, and it is a constitutional right for students. So when we look at the general breakdown, what you see is other sources, which includes federal money, is pretty small. You know, roughly in the state of Wisconsin, federal money is about 5 to 6%. And then we've got this division between state and local funds. In the state, on the state side, 38% about comes from general aid. So it comes from just the general revenue that the state has in their budget. And then, of course, as you all know, on the local side, it's local property taxes. When you look at this breakdown, some of you may have been in this arena long enough to remember the promise that the state gave us, that the state would pay 2/3 funding. And that was at the time that we got revenue caps. We'll talk about those too. When we got revenue caps, the state said that they would pay 2/3 of the cost of education, or 2/3 of that amount on the revenue caps. 38% is not 2/3. I think my math's right on that one. So that is something that has dwindled throughout time. And it's fortunate that the governor's proposed budget right now would move us back to 2/3 funding, but we'll have to see what the legislature says about that, or if the legislature actually enacts that. So school funding, I don't know if you can simplify Wisconsin school funding, but as I said, we have a revenue limit, and I don't have an arrow. I don't have an arrow here. Yeah, I can get an arrow here. So we have a revenue limit, and that's the amount that the state says the maximum that we can spend on per student. I prefer to call it a spending limit. And if you think about the state portion, that's the state equalization money. So you've got what you can spend per person or per child, and then you look at how much the state is going to give you. Doing the math on that, when you subtract the state equalization aid, you get the local share, which is the local property levy, or what the local school district is going to have to raise through property taxes to run the schools. Now, there are some things that are outside of the revenue limit. There's some per pupil aid and some categoricals. We'll talk a little bit about that, and federal funds. But that's the general picture. So in the state of Wisconsin, we've got these revenue limits. And when revenue limits were imposed up here, that was in 1993, if you see right here, you see the percentage of property tax, our reliance on property tax. And what happened is we became less and less reliant on property tax when we had that 2/3 promise, because 2/3 of the funding came from the state, and that's not property tax. And it has been creeping up and increasing. Now, down here is the average around the state, around the United States. So we are really much higher in terms of reliance on property tax than other states across the United States. That's kind of the system that we've adopted, is we're heavily dependent on the local level, or we've pushed the funding down to the local level. Here's another way to think about the cost sharing, the spending, and this is a little more detail in how you get to the cost sharing, and it emphasizes that we use prior year data. So we kind of work in a reimbursement mode. One of the things that's interesting about the reimbursement mode is that the governor has proposed a change in that, so that the school districts would get their money more frequently and closer to upfront, so we wouldn't have this time when local school districts had to borrow to pay their bills. In the state share, one of the things that the state formula does is it tries to even things out. It tries to give property poor school districts, because that's how you raise your local money, property poor school districts an opportunity to raise enough money to educate their students, and to raise enough money to kind of be equivalent with property wealthy districts in the state of Wisconsin. So the more the richer you are, the more property wealthy you are, the less state aid you get, and the property poorer you are, the more state aid you get. And you can kind of see this with the red and the blue. So it evens out to try and spend what every school district wants to spend, and looks at here, let me say it this way. What this formula is intended to do is to give more local control, so that even a property poor school district can have enough money to educate students. And if they want to raise their mill rate, they'll be able to get more money, even though at the local level, it doesn't yield as much because the state contributes. And this is really where you get into the nuts and bolts of it. And this is the DPI view. And we're not going to go into the negative secondary and negative tertiary aid. I want to think about this as a general view that the formula intends to mitigate those differences and help property poor districts be able to spend enough money for their students. Revenue limits. That's another thing. It makes it very opaque when you use different words, because revenue limits it really is spending limit. You know, you can only spend X amount of dollars. And in 1993-94, the state said, whatever you're spending right now, that's your cap. That's your revenue limit. And that's when they made that 2/3 promise, if you remember. That's your revenue limit. And we'll give you our state aid. And then what you have, that gap is what you need to raise through property taxes. But that revenue limit has caused disparities across the state of Wisconsin because it froze things in 1993. Whatever you were spending in 1993-94, it set you there. And it really, that's a long time ago. You know, that's almost 30 years ago. It may not reflect what's happening in your district now. Your 1993 spending may not reflect that, what's happening now. And it certainly doesn't have any standardization across the state of Wisconsin. It's frozen. Of course, you can go to referendum and ask your community to raise that revenue limit. And we've seen nearly every school district in the state of Wisconsin go to referendum between 1993 and now, because we have needed to increase those revenue limits. The legislature can also increase their revenue limit. And for a long time, they kind of did a cost of living regular increase on that so that you could project your income and you knew how much you were going to be able to spend per student. And then in 2010, that was frozen, and we have had very few revenue limit increases from the state since then. Oh, this is what I just said. So here in that 2010, 11, 12 budget was when we had a negative revenue limit adjustment. That is, it sunk, and of course, everybody took a cut, and people who are in education certainly remember that. We have a proposal now in the current budget proposal, the governor's budget proposal, to increase that revenue limit and to set us back on a more even keel that would give us regular revenue limit increases so that we could have some predictability, and so that we could recognize that things continue to cost more in most businesses, just like in education. So this is, if we think about per pupil aid, what the state gives us in terms of dollar amount, they've done this per pupil aid in addition to the formula, kind of on top of the formula that doesn't have any equalizing effect. So this is just a dollar amount for every student, regardless of how property wealthy or how property poor the school district is, regardless of the educational needs of the children in the district, the state can give a per pupil amount. And what you see on here is that we had kind of a steady per pupil amount. And the per pupil amount is really a political thing. It's a way to say to every legislature, every single one of your school districts will get something because they'll get per pupil aid. But it does not equalize. So it does not help those property poor districts whatsoever. It also doesn't recognize the need that children have in the district to provide more money for a harder job for a school district to do. And once again, you see this, this time right here. This is that Act 10, Act 33 time where we had significant budget cuts for public education. And then this piece here, what you've seen in the previous administration, and not in Governor Evers' administration, but during the Walker administration, it was at the legislature then, because it is the legislature that makes these rules. They moved to increases of per pupil rather than adding money to the formula, the equalization formula, they kept increasing the per pupil aid, which really, it increases the amount given, granted, but it also disequalizes across the state. So it doesn't recognize need and it doesn't recognize the local community situation. Categorical aids, we also, in addition to the formula and per pupil aid, we have a third kind of money, and that's categorical aids from the state. Here are some categorical aids. The biggest one would be special education, the special education aid that we have. And that's a reimbursement. When we started reimbursement for special education, the federal government and the state government said that they were really going to fully fund special education. That's never been true. The federal government never funded it the way they said they were going to, and neither did the state. The state's reimbursement, because it's actually a reimbursement, you have to spend money and then get, just like, you know, if you're traveling for business or something and you spend money within the rules and then you get reimbursed for it. That's the way special education aid goes. And in the state, in our state, that reimbursement rate has continued to decline. It went down as low as 25% before the last biennium, which is among the lowest reimbursement rates in the nation. It's kind of the lowest commitment to special education in the nation when we were at a 25% spending of state money. And in the last biennium, that was increased. The budget said that they were going to increase that to a 30% reimbursement rate, but they didn't fund that. And so they didn't add additional money. They added some money to it, but it brought us up to a 28% reimbursement rate right now. And the current proposal, the governor's proposal, is to increase that special education reimbursement rate up to up closer to 50%, 60% as we go along, as that goal of increasing the state commitment to special education. What happens with in the local school district, and as the superintendents who are here can attest to, I'm sure, is that we spend what we need to for special education. I mean, that's a federal statutory right for children. And so local school districts spend what they need to provide an adequate education for children, but they don't get reimbursed for it. So they need to take money out of their general fund and move it into their special education fund to do that job. Across the state of Wisconsin, school districts cumulatively transfer over $1 billion from their regular ed fund into their special education fund to make up that hole from state support. And that means that there are programs that school districts can't provide, programs that would help all children that they can't do, just to make sure that we provide what we need to for special education students, which we should do. I'm not trying to pit regular ed against special education. I'm just saying that this is a fact, that the state, the lack of commitment and the lack of funding from the state causes local school districts incredible pain in the state of Wisconsin. It's actually shameful, in my opinion. And we had when we had the Blue Ribbon Commission, we had a national expert who called our situation pitiful. Not what you want to be, huh? So what we see is that these days the state has reduced its commitment to public education. And let me see if I can pull that forward. The state has actually divested, reduced the amount that they spend in public education, the state share in public education, significantly since 2011, the 2010-2011 budget. Cumulatively, $3.9 billion. If you want to think about it in a different way, in terms of the percentage of the general fund that is spent on education, we've reduced that percentage of the general fund that we spend on public education from 38% of the general fund now down to 31% of the general fund. And granted, it is a huge part of the state budget. 31% on public schools is a huge part of the budget, but the amount that the state has been spending has continued to decline. Or you can think about it this way. This is another view of a longer term view of the percentage of the state budget, percentage of the general fund spent on public education. And of course you can see, here we had some years where there was 43% of our state budget was spent on public schools, and now we're down in the low 30s. And we have a system of funding private schools, but I'm going to hold on that one. I'm going to hold on that one and ask Patty to look in the chat so that we can talk about school finance. I know I just blathered on for a half an hour about school finance at you, but I'd like to know if there are any questions or comments. Those of you who spend a lot of time in this area, please correct me. What do we have there, Patty? Hopefully we have some comments in the chat.
Yes. Julie, we have a couple of questions. When the state first committed to 2/3 funding, did they fund schools at that level at that time?
Yes. And this was, ancient history. It was part of a three-legged stool. And one of the legs of the stool was that the state would spend 2/3, would finance education at 2/3 of the cost. Another leg of that stool was that revenue or spending would be capped, those revenue limits. And the third leg of the stool was a bargaining kind of thing, for wages for teachers. Now, the 2/3 funding's gone, the bargaining piece is gone, and now the only one piece of the stool that's left is the spending limit. But they did make good on their promise almost. Yeah, I think they made good on their promise at the beginning.
Another question is, has the per pupil aid kept up with inflationary costs?
The per pupil aid, if you think about it together, no. And it used to be that our revenue limits increased. Our revenue limits would increase so that we could continue to spend more and more based on inflation, but that has not happened. And the per pupil increase really has not been intended to keep up with inflation. This here, it does look like it goes up, significantly goes up per pupil, but you have to balance that out. And remember that less money was given in the formula and more money was given in per pupil aid. So the total amount is a decline in state funding, and it really hasn't changed local district spending because there's a spending limit. Another thing that has happened that you can't really see here is that when the state has increased their spending over the last 10 years, if they've added more money in per pupil, a lot of the times in those budgets, there wasn't an increase in the revenue limit. So if you remember that little piece that was the formula, I mean, in this formula, so when you add money, when you add state money, without increasing the revenue limit, the spending limit, what you can spend per pupil, all that really does is reduce property taxes or reduce the local share, because it's giving money, but it's not increasing the amount of money you can spend. So that's not keeping up with inflation either.
Another question, and I don't know if this is something that you'll address later, but how does the federal money from the latest COVID bill figure into this picture?
The money from the latest COVID bill does not figure into this picture, because those funds are provided to take care of needs that will occur in the next year to keep children safe, and to make sure that we have virtual schools when we need it, and to make up for all of the funding that the school districts had to lay out to provide virtual instruction and for PPE and for additional staffing, all of those additional costs. So really that is making up for expenses related to COVID. The state can't supplant that money. The state can't reduce the amount of money that they're going to spend and say, well, we've got money from the federal government. The relief bill, it won't let the state do that. And it's one-time money too. It's not ongoing money either.
Yeah. Given with some of our business partners in our community attending today, what's the importance of the English language, the English learners, and that funding to our business communities and our communities at large?
Well, I want to look at some of the things that we do in terms of English language learners, and if I can, well, how about we do that in a second? Because I want people to think about the changes in the state and the children's needs. Why is it important to a community to make sure that you help children learn English? Because it helps them become part of our community. That's one reason. It also helps them be able to work. So if they can get a stronger education as quickly as possible, it helps them be active members of your community, both economically and in terms of just being a community member.
And just real quick, will your slideshow be available for people?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, I will give it to you. I'll give a PDF of it to you, and then you can share it out however you want to.
We'll put it on our website.
Okay. I will also just here's a plug on the Wisconsin Public Education Network website. There's a School Finance 101, which is a presentation that I did to a larger statewide group about school finance. Then there is a School Finance 102 for those of you who want to get into the nitty-gritty of it. And Brian Ponke, who is the state's budget officer, explains much more detail about the education budget and goes into a lot of detail about the governor's proposals. And both of those recorded sessions are on the Wisconsin Public Education Network website.
And that's wisconsonnetwork.org, correct?
Yes, thank you.
All right, thank you.
Is that it? Okay, So let's now think about the job that schools have to do in the state of Wisconsin, and kind of look at, you know, a run of the last 15 years or so. See if I can get this to move. One thing that's happened to our state, and this is pre-COVID because we don't have the numbers post-COVID, is that poverty is growing significantly. If you watch this slide roll, as it becomes that dark purple is a free and reduced lunch rate for school districts of 50% or more. So 50% or more of children in those districts are at poverty level. And that's doubled since 2000. And I'm sure that it has increased more even nowadays with COVID. Also, we have a number of students, and this will increase again, of course. We have a number of students, a significant number of students across the state who are homeless, and that number has grown. If you see that run from 2003 to 2018, and you can see the significant increase in students who are homeless. One of the reasons we want to pay attention to homelessness is the stability for a child. And it's, put it bluntly, it's really hard for a child to focus on a math lesson when they don't know where they're going to sleep that night, when there's that instability in their family and their living situation. It distracts from their learning at a minimum. It also makes homework difficult and any other kind of stability difficult as well. So those children are you need to pay attention to, and they are more expensive to educate because you do provide additional services for them. I bring up poverty because it does impact student achievement. We know that low poverty districts generally perform much higher. We know that poor children and poor school districts perform much lower, and even poor children within a wealthy community, that poor child has a worse time. And simply, most often in poor families, there is a lack of literacy. At an early childhood level, there may not be reading materials available, so that early literacy is impacted and may be lost. The child might not come to school ready to learn when they come to 4K or to kindergarten, and making up that gap is incredibly difficult. So we have many, many children who never jump that gap and stay behind for all of their school years. But poverty does significantly impact student achievement. And of course, in the state, schools are the leading indicator of all sorts of population changes because there are a number of school children, and because they grow up. They grow up to be the population of the state of Wisconsin. So if you think about it in terms of demographics of students of color, we see that there are 30% of students in the state of Wisconsin, the public school students, are students of color, as opposed to 19% of people generally across the state. And in the state of Wisconsin, we have a significant racial achievement gap. It's not just poverty that explains a gap in achievement. We in the state of Wisconsin have a racial gap, so that you see here, this line across here is what the achievement would be for students who are white and economically disadvantaged. And you see that our African-American students, whether they're economically disadvantaged or not, are even below that. So that's a gap that is explained only by minority status. And I think if you think about students with significant numbers of students of color. Of course, we have our native districts, and then Milwaukee, Bayfield, Brown Deer. Some people are surprised by the percentage of students of color in many of these school districts, but that's how we have changed. 40 years ago, these numbers would be quite different. Also, something that's happened in our state is our population in the state has been moving south. So just in terms of population, oh, and I have a typo right there. There are more students in fewer districts, not more students, but more students in fewer districts, because our population has been moving to the south and the east in this state. If you the yellow on this rolling map is where school districts are gaining enrollment, and the black on this map, or the dark purple on this map, is the districts that are losing the most in terms of student enrollment. And just to make the point, there are many districts across the state of Wisconsin who are becoming poorer and smaller in terms of enrollment. And that impacts what those schools have to do. That certainly, it makes it more difficult to educate children who live in poverty because they are more expensive to educate. And when there are fewer students, you have some real diseconomies of scale because you still need a first grade classroom, but you have fewer students in that first grade classroom. And there is a time where you operate things with diseconomies of scale, when you haven't gotten so small that you can do a first and a second grade classroom. So it is it's really difficult for those school districts who are declining in enrollment. And if you look here in the Fox Valley, that's not your problem here, because you are one of the yellow communities where you are increasing in enrollment. And then, of course, there are COVID issues, and we won't go into all of those COVID issues. But there's my summary of challenges. There's a summary of challenges, and one of them is the voucher expansion. And if we want to talk about our voucher expansion, we can look at a couple slides. But Patty, can I ask to see if there are any comments or questions on this part before we go to vouchers, because voucher is really a kind of a separate piece.
Sure. One question is, a new question is, do you feel the legislators understand public school finance in Wisconsin? And if not, how can we help educate them? And are they ever embarrassed by the commitment or lack thereof to public education?
Well, the second part first, I don't know what's in their mind. I was on the Blue Ribbon Commission that the legislatures created in 2017, 18, 19, when we were working. And they listened to the stories, and they were moved by the stories of challenges that the school districts have. But when they went back into session, they didn't do anything to change or to improve those situations significantly. They agreed on a lot of things that should be changed, but they didn't sponsor bills or vote on bills, vote positively on bills that would have improved the situation.
And then I think we're caught up. There is a question about vouchers, but I'll let you, I think it's best if you continue.
Somehow when we were changing things around, I lost all of my voucher slides. So I'm going to have to go back to my other slide deck to find my voucher slides, I think. Let me see, let me look again. Oh no. I have one. I only have one voucher slide left, and I don't know what happened to them. Let me look. Let me just do, rather than finding finding that slide deck, I really would just explain, try to explain this in a general way. Wisconsin is kind of an experimental state in terms of vouchers, and we the way we fund it is for most of the vouchers, the funds are removed from the general fund first. So the voucher costs come from the general fund of the state, and they pay for those costs up front. They pay for those vouchers first, and those are, a set dollar amount, and they pay for that. And as you can see in this slide, the increasing number of students that are participating, just from 2017 until 2020, an increasing number of students. So they pay for that, and then with the remainder that's left, that's what gets divided up for the public schools. So even if you don't have a voucher program or a school district or a private school that is accepting voucher students, or if you don't have an independent charter in your school district, you are still impacted on a statewide level because the state uses its general fund to fund those vouchers, and it keeps increasing. That voucher money, we refer to that as a sum sufficient appropriation, because they pay for every voucher. They say that they're going to get every voucher that's redeemed. They pay a certain amount, and it's always the same amount. And in the rest of education, we kind of have a sum certain. We have a pile of money and we divide it up. And if that's less than what the state promised us, well, then that's less than what the state promised us. That's kind of what's happened with the 2/3 funding promise. That's certainly what has happened with the special education reimbursement. The pot just keeps getting smaller, and so everybody's share of the pot just keeps getting smaller and smaller as it goes along. So right now, we spend over $300 million in our voucher and independent charter programs around the state, and it's a significant amount of money. So 1920, our cost is, $351 million. That's a significant sum spent out of our general fund. Now, some legislatures will say that it really doesn't impact public school funding at all, because we get what we get, and this is additional funding. It's hard for me to believe that the legislature would spend an additional $351 million on something that on public education, on education generally. They really do think about education as K-12 education. And right now, they are funding two systems of education. The one that is constitutionally required, publicly funded and publicly controlled, and then the system that is the additional system of private schools, which is privately controlled and publicly funded, to the tune of $351 million in the state. So that's my bit on vouchers. Patty, you said that you had a question, one question about vouchers?
Yep. And how, the question was, how do vouchers affect funding? So
significantly and negatively.
And I think another question, how does the cost of a voucher compare to what a district receives in state funding?
The state share of state funding average across the state is about $5,000. The voucher spending is more than that. The voucher spending for a private school on the K-12 average is $5,000. The privately run vouchers, the independent vouchers, are reimbursed to the tune of $8,600, which is more than the $5,000 that the state spends on the average for every child in the public school. And then there's a special needs voucher, which is for children with special education needs. And that voucher is $12,000, a little over $12,000, more than twice what the average state spending is for a regular ed student in the state of Wisconsin. And also, when we were talking about special education reimbursement, the state reimburses those private schools at a 90% rate. 90% of their spending is reimbursed for special education needs. And if you recall, currently in the state of Wisconsin, the state reimburses public schools at a rate of 30%. So they spend 3 times more for special education needs in a private school.
Julie, are local property taxes impacted by vouchers?
Absolutely, because money, it's not just money from the general fund, but money comes out of the school district, the local school district in that geographic area. So money gets pulled right out of their account, in addition to the money that's taken out of the general fund. And so your local school board has to make a decision. Are they going to just reduce their spending entirely, or will they increase their taxation if they can increase their taxation to make up for that gap? If they're already levying to the max, then of course the school district has to cut to make up for those vouchers. And I know that pro-voucher people say, well, we're taking kids out of the public school and putting them in the private school. So of course the public school can cut their funding because they don't educate that child. Not the case. With the vouchers we currently have now, the flavor of vouchers we currently have now in the state of Wisconsin, 70% of those students have never been in a public school. So the only thing that has changed from year 1 to year 2 is whether their parents pay for their tuition or whether the state pays for their tuition.
Julie, how can legislators be reminded that constitutionally the requirement for them is the responsibility to fund public, not private education?
Their constitutional authority requires them to spend on public education to an adequate level. At least that's what our state Supreme Court has said. And in the state Supreme Court cases, they've said you can spend money on private schools through vouchers unless it impacts your obligation under the Constitution to spend on public schools. I think we need to remind every single one of them. Every time you talk to your legislature, remind them that that is a state constitutional obligation to fund students' constitutional rights to a public education. And you just have to remind them over and over again. And at some point, we need to hold our legislators accountable.
I think we've caught up with questions. The representative or the person attending on behalf of Representative Cabral Cabrera out of the Neenah area is going to hop off. And so she, I think P wants to thank Julie for your presentation. We have about 2 minutes left before we promised all that we would wrap this up. One question that just came in is, why hasn't Wisconsin sued the legislature for equity of funding?
Most people who are in a position to start that lawsuit are afraid that the current Wisconsin Supreme Court would not make it any better. And that's just a practicality. Almost all of this is politics. And unfortunately, in prior years, funding public education adequately was not a partisan issue. These days, funding, unfortunately, politics comes into play, and our children are the ones that get hurt. They're playing politics with our children and not meeting a number of their needs. You know, years ago, our parents and grandparents created this great public school system in the state of Wisconsin, and we used to be a leader in all sorts of things, early childhood education being one of them, and special education as well. And now, as we have continued to decrease the amount of money that we're willing to spend on public education and reduce our taxes at the same time, I mean, that's the function, our schools have suffered, and our children have suffered as well. I like to remind legislators that our grandparents and great-grandparents thought about our future so that we could have a great education. And I think it's our time to think about our grandchildren and our great-grandchildren so they can have the same opportunities that our grandparents and great-grandparents gave to us.
Julie, has the legislature ever considered an alternative source of revenue to fund vouchers?
You know, the legislature has never actually voted on a voucher bill, and they haven't had hearings on a voucher bill. They just roll it into the general budget bill and kind of slip it in, sometimes slip it in the dark of night. So no, there really haven't been hearings on alternative revenue sources or whether or not the state wants vouchers.
Thank you. Just one comment about, again, that constitutional duty to fund public ed. And the question seems to be, to what extent are they required to fund public education?
The Wisconsin Supreme Court says that they are required to fund education to make school districts nearly uniform as practicable, which is the equity kind of thing, so that you can provide an education that children in your district need across the state of Wisconsin. And the Wisconsin Supreme Court has interpreted this to be a child's state constitutional right to an adequate education. Adequate, I know, the devil's in the details, right?
Right. It looks like Representative Lee Snodgrass was here, and she wanted to just thank everyone on her behalf as well that for attending and learning about school finance. Julie, if you have any other closing comments, we'll wrap this up.
Well, you know, my closing comments are really just thank you all for being willing to learn about school finance. It's not an easy topic, and it's honestly one that many people want to avoid. So I appreciate your time and your attention. Thanks.
Before you leave, the PDF of Julie's presentation will be on the website of Fox Cities Advocates for Public Education. That's FCA4PE.org. Just go to the resources page. And additionally, while you're there, if you'd like to subscribe to our free newsletter, that's a bi-monthly, on school news in the Fox Cities, there's a couple of places there are links to click, and we will enroll you in that. So thank you so much, Julie. I think you gave us not only school finance, but also law and politics and some history together, and I appreciate that so much.
Thank you so much. Have a nice day.